Hi, it's Professor Unmack, and I'm here to talk in this, hopefully, relatively short video about what's called the incumbency advantage. So it's an election year, 2020, and there's an incumbent president running for re-election, President Trump. There are a number of incumbent senators running for re-election to the Senate, and every single one of the 435 seats in the House of Representatives is up for election. And what we mean by the incumbency advantage is the tendency, and it's been this way for many, many, many decades, probably throughout our history, the people who hold office, should they choose to run for re-election, have a very high likelihood of getting reelected, which is kind of ironic because we don't really like Congress as an institution these days. If you look at the congressional job approval, if I can get this website to come up, you can see that in the most recent polling from various polling sources, these are polls about congressional job approval. The vast majority of the public disapproves of how Congress does its job. And it's been that way for a really, really long time, especially in modern times. So it's ironic in some ways that while we don't like Congress as an institution, we tend to really like our own members of Congress. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the factors that contribute to that. The incumbency advantage is members of Congress who choose to run for re-election are usually successful. And we can look at the incumbency rates for the House of Representatives over time by going to this website called opensecrets.org. I love this website, Open Secrets. They have so much information about elections and financing of elections and all kinds of information about money in elections. But they also have this handy dandy chart for us to look at, which is the U.S. House re-election rates from 1964 to 2018. So for the past 5 decades or so. And you can see that there's a high percentage of re-election. Now, in the 2018 election, you could see about 90% of people who chose to run for re-election got reelected. That meant that enough Republicans lost their seats that the Democratic Party was able to take control of the chamber. So high re-election rates doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be change in the House of Representatives, but it does mean that for people who have to ask to get their jobs back every 2 years, they have pretty high levels of job security. And it's not quite as true for the Senate. Senators are maybe a little bit less likely to get reelected. It's in the 80s instead of in the 90s, partly because they tend to attract really strong challengers, people who have a lot of name recognition and who have a lot of money. It's much more likely that members of the House of Representatives won't have really serious challengers challenging them. There's a bunch of things that explain the advantage, and I just want to talk about them. Some of these are going to be explained more deeply in the chapter in your textbook on Congress, and one of them, campaign finance, we're going to talk about it in detail a little bit later in the semester. But there's basically 4 things that help explain the incumbency advantage. The first is name recognition. The second is favorable districting, sometimes as the result of gerrymandering. The third is money, a fundraising advantage for incumbents. And the fourth is district services or casework. And we'll talk about each of these in turn. Let me start with name recognition because it's probably the easiest one. Members of Congress tend to be much better known than the people who run against them. It's as simple as that. And when they see a name on a ballot, there's a certain percentage of voters who are going to vote for a name they're familiar with. And that might account for 4% of the vote, 5% of the vote. In a close election, being better known than the person you're running against can be very helpful. This is one of the reasons senators don't have quite as high of an incumbency advantage as members of the House, because a lot of times the people who run against incumbent senators have quite a bit of name recognition of their own. They might be their state's governor, for example. In the state of Montana this year, the Republican Senate incumbent is being challenged by the state's Democratic governor. So they both have a lot of name recognition. But generally speaking, especially for the House of Representatives, the people who run against the incumbents typically don't have the same kind of name recognition, and that can help. So the second thing is, and it's super important, is favorable district lines. These are what we call safe seats. So members of the House of Representatives represent, for the most part, portions of states. They don't represent the whole state. They represent what's called a district. And those district lines are drawn after every census, and they're drawn in some states, like California, they're drawn by a nonpartisan, well, say a bipartisan citizen commission. And in some states, they're drawn by the state legislatures. So in those states, the process of drawing these district boundary lines is super political, and it can result in the establishment of seats, districts, where the seat is safe for whichever party holds the seat. So it might be a safe Democratic seat where, say, 65% of the registered voters in that district are Democrats. It's very difficult for a Republican to win in a seat like that. Or in a seat like, say, up in Placerville, which is very conservative, the congressional district in that area is a safe Republican seat. It's very difficult for a Democrat to win a seat where the voter registration is overwhelmingly in favor of the other party. And most members of Congress serve in districts that are favorable to their political party. Some of that is done through gerrymandering, which is politically manipulating those lines to create these safe seats. And some of these seats are safe just because of where people live. So for example, if you look at San Francisco is a very liberal city. And so most of the people who are going to be voting in any district around San Francisco are going to be mostly Democrats. So even though those seats aren't gerrymandered, they're not drawn with political goals in mind, the way gerrymandering is done, the seat is still safe for a Democrat because of where people live. Your book has a whole section on gerrymandering, one of your investigations for Chapter 4, and also I've included some additional information about gerrymandering in a separate redistricting page in your module for this week. But most members of Congress serve in districts that are favorable to their political party. And so once they get elected, unless things change, unless the district party makeup changes, they'll usually get reelected because Democrats tend to vote for Democrats and Republicans tend to vote for Republicans. Gerrymandering is very controversial. So this is a little cartoon where you look back in the time of the founding, when the framers of the Constitution were talking about voters should select the people they want to represent them. One of the criticisms of gerrymandering is that politicians pick their voters by drawing the district boundary lines so that their district will have favorable voters in it. It's very controversial, as you'll see when you get through that material in the textbook and in the redistricting page that I put in our module. This is going to come up when we talk about elections a little bit further in the semester. We'll talk more specifically about how campaign finance works, but for now, you should know that there is a fundraising advantage for incumbents. So people who are already in office can almost always raise as much money as they think they're going to need to get reelected. They can almost always raise way more money than their challengers, which of course allows them to do a lot more campaign advertising. It allows them to do a lot more voter outreach, etc. And in most races, the incumbent has more money than the challengers. And in fact, in most elections, in order for a challenger to beat an incumbent, they have to raise significantly more money than the incumbent, and it's really hard for them to do that. Most people who contribute to campaigns on a regular basis, political action committees and wealthy individuals, et cetera, they tend to be pretty practical. And it's like a catch-22. If you, since the incumbent is more likely to get reelected, you're probably not going to give a lot of money to a challenger because they don't have very much chance of winning. But at the same time, if they can't raise a lot of money, they can't get elected. So it becomes a sort of never-ending cycle. We'll go back to open secrets for a minute, and I'll show you in the current election cycle how the advantage is playing out. So this chart is the incumbency advantage in fundraising for the 2020 cycle. So this is this year's election cycle. They're going to raise, well, they'll probably still keep raising money. The election's not too far away, but like this is for Senate races. So there are 31 incumbent senators running for re-election. About a third of the Senate is up for election every 2 years. They serve 6-year terms. And on average, they've raised almost $13 million on average. Some Senate races are going to be more expensive than others, but on average, incumbent senators have raised about $13 million. Looking at their challengers, these are people who ran in primaries and stuff, but the number of the amount of money that challengers can raise is a fraction of what incumbents can raise. And this helps contribute to the incumbency advantage. So you can see that there's a lot of money raised and spent in elections, but most of it goes to incumbents. For the House of Representatives, House districts tend to be much, much smaller than states. For example, California has 55 House congressional districts. So each member of the House of Representatives represents about 750,000 people. So House races tend to not be as expensive to run as Senate races. They don't raise quite as much money as senators, but the difference between the incumbents and the challengers is just as great. So on average, there are 407 incumbents running for re-election in the House out of the 435, which means that some people are retiring and decided not to run again for re-election. But on average, those who are running for re-election have raised almost $2 million, as opposed to about 10% of that for their challengers. So you can see that that's a pretty big advantage, and it helps them get elected fairly regularly. So that's part of the incumbency advantage. Again, a little bit later in the semester, we're going to talk about how campaign finance works and what the restrictions are and stuff. But for now, you should just know that incumbents can usually raise way, way, way more than their challengers. And then the last thing that I would point out is because an incumbent is already in office, they're in a position to help the people in their district cut through government red tape or get information or get help with an issue that they might be having that involves the government. And that's what we call casework, or it's called constituent casework. And incumbents at every level of government are able to do this. And of course, it's very positive. It makes the person, it makes the incumbent look good. And district services might include things like going to a community meeting or meeting with groups of people or solving a neighborhood problem by getting a traffic signal put in or getting speed bumps put in. I used to work in local government. I worked for a Sacramento City Councilwoman, and I did all of her constituent casework. So local government is very local, right? So the kinds of help that people would call me for would be, there's a dog running loose in my street, and I can't get animal control to come out and pick up the dog. Can you help me? Or the solid waste has missed my street's garbage pickup for 2 weeks in a row. Can you help me with that? And by working with the government agencies and trying to resolve people's problems, that's very positive in the community. People talk about how much help they got from the incumbent, et cetera. If you're an incumbent member of the House of Representatives, for example, people might call you for help working. They might have a problem with Social Security agency, or they might be trying to help a family member from another country immigrate to the United States, or they might have any number of issues that they want help with the federal government. Members of the California state legislature can help their constituents with issues involving the Department of Motor Vehicles or another state agency. And so that's what we call casework. And pretty much every elected official has somebody on their staff who that's their job. So in the case of the House of Representatives and the United States Senate, they have several people who do casework. Some of their staff work on legislation. They work on getting bills passed. But some of their staff work on casework, on helping their constituents. The constituents contact their members of Congress for helps with lots of things. And we sometimes refer to that as help getting through government red tape. So I think I have a lot of you, if you go to American River College, a lot of you probably live in Doris Matsui's congressional district. She's the member of the House of Representatives whose district includes American River College. American River College is right on the border between Doris Matsui's district and it's Ami Bera's district. I live in Ami Bera's district. We live out in Fair Oaks. But most of you, or a lot of you, probably live in Doris Matsui's district. And I'll just point out, not only does each incumbent member of the House and incumbent member of the Senate have their own website maintained by the House of Representatives or the Senate, but this is where you can go to get help, services. You can get coronavirus updates. You can get information if you own a small business. They have help with a federal agency. So if you are experiencing a problem with a federal agency, they may be able to help you. So they give you all the information that you might need, and you can email them, and you can get answers to your questions on their website. And they know that if they help you, you're probably more likely to vote for them, and you're probably more likely to say nice things about them when you're talking to your friends, etc. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. So name recognition, they tend to be better known than their challengers. They usually serve in safe seats. Estimates are that only about 10% of the 435 seats in the House of Representatives are not safe, are really, truly competitive, where you can't really predict with any level of certainty whether the Democrat or the Republican will win in any election cycle. About 90% of the seats in the House of Representatives, those of us who follow elections pretty closely, can be pretty confident that the incumbent will win from that political party. Fundraising advantage, and then this ability to do casework. Those are the things that help people who are already in office stay in office. So that was, I think, actually relatively quick. Thanks for watching.